Air Marshal Mayhew, Gerry Mayhew, it's very good for you to join us today.
Thanks, Craig. Nice to see you. Thank you for inviting me to do it.
You're very welcome. So we have about 20 minutes to talk about your experience and expertise on the subject of decision-making and what influences you. So perhaps I could just invite you to introduce yourself briefly for the audience first, or before we get into it.
Yeah, Gerry Mayhew. I'm one of the two deputy commanders to the Chief of the Air Staff, and my responsibility is for operations, which is effectively the Chief Operating Officer. I run the day-to-day activities of the service.
Okay, thanks, Gerry. So plenty of scope for talking about decision-making, I feel.
Yeah, I hope so, yes.
Absolutely. So perhaps we could start our conversation about decision-making by perhaps I just invite you to explore generally in such a critical role, in such a senior role, how you go about framing decision-making in your organisation such that you make sure that it's being done effectively, you know, the thousands of decisions that clearly get made every day. How do you go about doing that in such a senior role?
I think there's quite a few factors that play into the ability to make decisions at this level, and most of which is based on, for my count, 34 years of experience in the service. But having had breadth within that service, so I haven't just been flying aeroplanes, so it has been a broad church of my own background. And therefore, I think drawing on similar experiences of others from across a wider set of cultures and backgrounds and experiences allows us to come to a set of decisions, not necessarily in a collegiate manner, but just having a baseline of evidence available to be able to make decisions, some quick, some less so. And dependent upon the necessity, you have a pile of evidence that is that big or that big in order to make a decision. So, and that's what I think is so much fun and exciting about being a decision maker in an organization at whatever level, is you can draw on so many facets of culture and background and experience in order to make your decisions. So Gerry, it's almost like there's sort of almost two or three key components to effective decision making in your organization. So the first is this ability to draw on many different facets, experiences, cultures even. And I assume that that's in your organization as well as your own personal diverse background, is that right? So you feel that this diversity in your organization, you draw on that as a great strength in the decision-making process? Very much so, and in the broadest sense of the word culture, because when you're operating at the strategic or certainly at the high end of operational activity, minute by minute or hour by hour, then you do need to recognize that it isn't, those cultures are many and varied, and you will be able to pull on them for inputs depending upon what they are. So some are political, some are military, some are industry, some are from our BAME and gender networks, et cetera, et cetera. There are just so many facets to pull on. Yes, absolutely. And that is the organisational as well as my own.
Indeed. Sorry to interrupt. So the key is diversity there, isn't it? It's almost diversity of thought, of approach, of background, and drawing on as much of that diversity as you can to increase the overall level of effective decision making. And
in a clear recognition, you have to have the awareness that those are out there as well, because if you're not aware that they're there, you can't pull on them. You can't draw from those experiences, or you can't use the experiences of others to facilitate that conversation. And I think that's important as well, is a lot of our great people are door openers into those cultures and backgrounds. So it's not just about my immediate network to allow me to make those openings. There are a whole host of others that will facilitate that conversation lower down.
It almost makes it sound as if, and I suppose it is in organisational sense, it almost makes decision-making sound quite a collective process, almost, the way you envisage it for the organisation.
It can be.
Is that, yeah?
It can be. If you've got time, I think you have an ability to reach into the organisation, or to actually, sometimes the organisation comes to you and says, hey, I need you to do this, please. Yeah. So you will draw on the evidence and people that are out there. Others, because of either the safety or the emergency or the operational necessity, will not allow you time. And that's where that experience and length of time in a job also allows you to have a baseline of your own decision-making potential that you can pull on straight away. So it is a mix.
And so we'll perhaps come back to your own experience of decision-making in a second, Gerry. So is there, is part of this therefore also making sure somehow or other that the decisions are made at the right level in your organisation by the people who've got that back? I mean, is it almost the structure of decision-making? Is that also part of your reflection on on decision-making in the organisation?
Very much so. And in the military, we're often accused as senior officers of having the long screwdriver or the giant loud hailer down into the organisation and the job that you were in last, because you're only as good as the job you did before. So there has to be a real discipline of allowing other parts of the organisation to make those decisions that are theirs to make. And sometimes you get it right, sometimes you get it wrong. And you do have to look yourself in the mirror and go, no, this is not mine. And facilitate those decisions further down. Don't just slope your shoulders and say, crack on. It's help some of those decisions, but don't make them yourself. It's just add the intent. I think that's another thing that we are trying to do better in the Royal Air Force, is provide those lower parts of the service or other parts of the service a much clearer set of broad guidance to allow people to make those decisions. Because if they don't know what you want at the top of the organisation, then they will be operating in fog down below. So clear annual, monthly or weekly, whatever it is, as to what things you know are coming, and a broad feel for where you want to end up allows other people to make those decisions, and you can empower them. And then I think you gain pace and understanding in all parts of the organisation.
So it's not just the rank structure then, if I can put it in brutal terms like that, that's actually helping that. That's almost like that's the background to the effective decision making. What you've also got is a structure that you are clearly at the top of, that allows those decisions to be made at the right time, in the right way, in the right frame, or with the right boundaries around them. Is that right? Is that you're actually conscious of having that structure?
Absolutely. I'm conscious of it most of the time, in that we try and use that in order that we don't hoover everything up to the top. If everybody tried to send a decision up to the top echelons of the service, we would just get bogged down. And I think having the right level of decision maker and telling them that they are the decision maker and empowering them to do so, actually, I think it brings great strength to the organisation and to the individual. This is not a power conversation. It's about allowing those things allowing those decisions to be made at the right level that keeps us moving at the right pace.
You also mentioned, I think, in your initial summary, so that was one of the aspects that you mentioned. So we've talked about the diversity in the organisation. We've talked about the structure of decision-making. You also mentioned evidence. I forget exactly how you said, but you said sometimes you've got a little bit of evidence, sometimes you've got a lot of evidence. And how does because evidence clearly is part of the decision-making, how does that play into it, Gerry, in terms of that structure? Does it, or do you expect people to be able to assess the evidence themselves, or versus, how does that play in?
I think defence, I'll speak for the Royal Air Force, I can't speak for wider defence, but sometimes it is reliant on that experience as opposed to the evidence that is available because of, again, the time that is given to you to make decisions. If you have adequate time to be able to pull on layers of evidence to support that decision making, then you should, in order that you are given the best set of decision tools. And I think that the one area that we have really tried to concentrate on in the last 2 years is our risk analysis. And that's risk against not just individual safety or objectives. It is the strategic nature of our service and the 5 objectives that we try to run towards in the RAF strategy. So if you flip those strategic objectives on their head and put them in risk terms and then bring evidence against them, using great tools, AI, machine learning and such like, which we are now investing in, your risk horizon, for want of a better term, is a much richer one. And then you can accept and define what your risk appetite and your risk tolerance is. And therefore, once everybody understands that, they and I can make the decisions within those appetites and tolerances. And if we've got a really strong baseline of understanding of our risk, as opposed to that great phrase, military judgment, then I think, again, people are just equipped to make the right decisions at the right level and at the right tempo.
And you are actually starting to use things like machine learning to be able to assist you in that assessment, is that right?
We're just introducing the tools now. So we're probably by the end of this calendar year, in a much better evidence-based decision tool space. Because we've taken a long time to develop those tools with industry partners for the needs of the Royal Air Force. And we're talking to other parts of the Ministry of Defence now about our experiences of that so that they may be able to draw on those tools as well in the future.
That's fascinating. It almost sounds, though, as if and I know this isn't the case, but I'll be interested in your reflection on it, that you are almost trying to eliminate, in some way, the kind of the intuitive, you mentioned, the military judgment, which I know is a bit of a cliche, but eliminate the sort of intuitive or sixth sense nature of decision-making, to make it into something which is kind of almost artificially intelligence supported, so that you always get to the right decision. Presumably that's not the case, but how does it balance in terms of that sort of intuitive element of decision making?
So again, because of the strategic nature of the business and the force, if you have time to look at evidence, then why wouldn't you? For financial, for reputational, for safety, and for all aspects of our output, if you've got evidence to support, then you would draw on it. But there is an element of that experience and that intuition that still is in there, that the hairs on the back of the neck, the I've been there before moment, that just add that, the reality of a decision that you've got to make. I would use an example in the safety arena when several years ago, colleagues and I had to make some decisions on stopping a particular aircraft from flying, a whole fleet. Akin to a 737 kind of decision with the MAX for Boeing, but this was one of our Royal Air Force aircraft, where we had some really wide and broad evidence to support our decision-making. But we also knew, for the output of the operations and for the safety of our people, that there was an element, some evidence, hey, we just need to make this decision, because if we don't have all the evidence yet, but if we keep taking risk upon risk without evidence, then we might fall off a cliff that we don't want to fall off. So there was a mixture of evidence and intuition and experience that allowed us to make a rapid decision to say, stop, let's assess, gather more evidence, and make further decisions. So there's not just the timeline, but there's a hierarchy of essential decisions and follow-on decisions that you've also got to consider here, some of which are easy to make, some of which are more challenging. And I think in a hierarchy-based organization where there is government oversight of what you do, it can be challenging for some people to make that leap and say, no, I am responsible, I am accountable, and therefore I am drawing on the evidence of my experience to make this decision now. But if you've got the confidence to do that, then I think that's also about my responsibility to help others gain that confidence in the organization.
So many interesting insights from the example you gave us there, Gerry. So if I could perhaps just pick up on a couple of them. You said that the political oversight that you have presumably just would, to use the term you used, just allow you to slope shoulders if you're not careful, and just sort of almost pass it up the chain. Is that the thing that you really do have to avoid the risk of? Is that what you meant by that potential political dimension?
I think some decisions that the tactical corporal or the operational air marshal will make that will affect a government, it's not an irregular thing. We will be doing things in the world that will affect how the Prime Minister and his government on this occasion will be seen. And therefore, there is inevitably some element of senior official or ministerial oversight into quite a lot of what we see. Not in the detail, but again, there's that intent from politics has to be there for us to be able to make those decisions. So I'm not nervous of that. I'm aware of it. And that awareness allows me to make some of the decisions I do make, which can seem a bit odd to the organisation sometimes.
Because you know of the political dimensions of the decisions that you're having to make.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I'll try and explain that to the echelons of the organisation that don't have that exposure, in order that they've got the context to make the subsequent decisions in their part of the organisation.
So part of what you're doing as the senior leader in this organisation is explaining why those decisions have been made when they perhaps don't look necessarily the most obvious, and there's almost an obligation on you to give that explanation to allow them to make the right decisions subsequently. Is that right?
Absolutely, and I think it's where you can have the freedoms to explain those decisions, some of which in a military organisation you don't, some of which it's a salute, turn to the right and carry on kind of approach. Right. But if I can bring people with me and explain the context, then you have their buy-in, you have their decision-making potential enhanced as well. But it is important, I think, to take your people with you. If they just see a set of random decisions being made that affect them, we've all been the person on the Clapham omnibus going, what's in it for me? Why are they doing this? If you can explain using the tools we have nowadays, and particularly during COVID, where we've moved so much virtually and being able to speak to the organisation in a broader, faster and better way, then why wouldn't you? Try and explain to them. That will allow them to understand, and therefore they're probably more likely to follow you to the destination.
And presumably also make better decisions themselves if they know the context and the sort of the answer to the why question, right? So we would presumably.
I hope so. But also they will feed your subsequent decisions, because if they're bought in, part of that thing we talked about earlier of the empowerment agenda is they'll actually tell you, because they feel that they can, when you're perhaps misjudged or don't have another bit of evidence, or they're supportive. So it again feeds to the subsequent conversation, allowing other people to understand the context.
Indeed, and that was the other aspect that I wanted to dig into a little bit more, because we're often, I suppose, we're mistaken to talk about the individual decision, haven't we? I mean, clearly there's the incident the decision you described involved a sequence of decisions, was it not? And so therefore, presumably part of this is the feedback loop, both from inside the organisation, being able to see the consequences where you can of one decision and then use that information to make a subsequent decision. Is that something that also that you are conscious of and that you reflect on in the decision-making process?
Yes, I don't know whether I purposefully reflect on it, but I just know the richness of, when you can, drawing on other people for the feedback loop. And again, I would hate to come across as I'm always collegiate about asking for opinions or asking for data. Some of them you just don't have the time, or you are in a position, you as the senior leader are the responsible and accountable individual, that you have to make those decisions. But where I possibly can, I will draw on a wider audience to facilitate my own decision making and to provide feedback for them.
And the other aspect of that sequence of decisions, is there a way of, are there lessons that can be drawn from a major decision that you had to take? And you were talking about having to ground a fleet of aircraft, essentially. And I think you talked about a sequence of things that led up to that. Are there lessons to be drawn about the sequence of decision-making that goes on around a big decision, if you like, in that kind of context? Is there anything that you can say more about that?
I think the urgency of some decisions, people put them off waiting for the evidence. And this is that really odd balance of how much evidence do you need to make a decision that you know is the right one, but you're waiting for more. I think that's probably the biggest challenge that's come to me in that particular example. Another one was, I was given the responsibility to be the senior officer responsible for the RAF 100 flypast over London. And thank God it was a blue day. Weather was perfect and all the aeroplanes got serviceable and was... the event was the spectacle that we had hoped it to be and was safe. Subsequently, 2 or 3 days later, we were supposed to do the same fly past at the International Air Tattoo at Fairford, and not such a good outcome on this one because the weather was horrific. And if I'd have put 100 aeroplanes at various speeds into the biggest thunderstorm that Oxfordshire had seen or Gloucestershire had seen for many a month, then you can imagine that some of my decisions and those that were subsequently down in other parts of the organisation would have been very much called to boot. So there various levels come in to facilitate an organisational output.
And what would you draw from that, actually, Gerry, from that really pertinent example of decision making that says, if I'm thinking, of course, about perhaps younger or perhaps less experienced people than yourself who'd be interested in drawing from your experience, what would you say to them about being put in that situation? How to handle it, how to deal with it?
Don't be afraid to make the decision. You know where the timeline is going to stop. If you haven't made a decision by then you probably understand the outcomes of not having made that decision. So don't wait until the other side of that line. If it is the decision that is right and keeps people safe, in that instance, on a safety issue, if you've kept people safe, or you've prevented a reputational foul or a financial foul, then nobody's going to come hunting for you afterwards. If you've delayed, or you've allowed somebody else to make it without the context, and they make the incorrect decision, then those are the moments when you will always look yourself in the mirror and go, do you know, I could have made that, and I could have made it a lot earlier. So I think it's being aware of the time, being aware of who is responsible and accountable. And if it is you, then you are cleared to make that decision when you have the evidence or you have the feel that it's right to do it. Don't be afraid.
Fascinating. And it strikes me that there are going to be some additional tools available to your decision makers. I mean, I'm so interested in the development of machine learning that you're using for risk assessment. Would you be able to perhaps just, and we are getting towards our time, unfortunately, but characterize what decision may look like once you have those available? Because you said this is actually coming quite soon. Is that right?
Yeah, I think we're a couple of years away from the AI tools really catalyzing it as much as we would want. But I think there are some decisions that will just be taken away from us. And we've got to be comfortable with that. I think we will test it, and we will do workshops and exercises where we've put AI and machine learning into positions to take some of those lower order decisions. Because in the end, at the moment, we are still accountable, often in law, that a person must make a decision rather than a machine. So I think we're on the very beginnings of a journey that will see some of those decisions being removed from a person and allowed to a machine. And I think we will see that in operations as well. That's the important thing, that we are not just in the risk conversation having this, but we're having it in the uncrewed aircraft or spacecraft or cyber situation, where some of our operational decisions will perhaps accelerate faster than the commander or leader is able to think about. And that's a really unusual situation we'll find ourselves in. And we're not yet really in a position to understand it. So early doors, but we really want to lead the conversation of what does this mean for a leader of the future.
Sounds like potentially a future subject for another CAS conference in
I think so. Yeah, very much so.
Absolutely. Well, we are unfortunately, as ever, up against our time. So Marshal Gerry Mayhew, it just remains for me to thank you so much on behalf of the Taylor Academy and indeed the University of Lincoln for your time today and unpicking.
Thank you. Really appreciate it. Thank you for having me.
Great talking to you. Thank you.
Thanks.